Well, let's return now to the release of those Mandelson files yesterday, and we're expecting to see the Prime Minister later, who will be questioned about their contents. Well, let's speak now to Paul Britton, Managing Director at Britton and Time Solicitors. Thanks so much for joining us. This story can feel quite technical, a tranche of documents released, the vetting process, internal warnings to the Prime Minister. But at the heart of this is about trust in government, Paul, isn't it? Why should the public care about that vetting process, first of all? Morning to you.
Good morning. Well, look, the public should care because we put these people in charge of running our country and our affairs. And, the role that Mandelson had was probably one of the most prestigious roles that any individual could hold in government. Ambassador to, or trade envoy to, the United States of America. When we look at the employment contract, and I think that's probably one of the most key legal things at the moment, Mandelson has demanded nearly £500,000 of taxpayers' money as a severance pay to bring what was a fixed-term contract to an end. They've settled at £75,000. Now, is that value for money? Some would say yes, some would say no. How much would the legal bill be for the taxpayer if they were to fight Mandelson in the courts? What we're looking at here is what Alan Mandelson will say is a wrongful dismissal case. Now, in employment law, lots of people will talk about unfair dismissal. Now, that's just being entitled to a fair process, which would come at the moment after you've completed 2 years of employment. But under a fixed-term contract, what we'd normally see is some sort of provision that would say, if you've committed gross misconduct during your role, and we have to remember the allegation is abuse in public office, which arguably, if found guilty, and another point before I make this one is that the government already has all of these documents. Although they are being released to us now, they are already seized of whether or not there is a strong case against Mandelson to have summarily dismissed him from his role. And if there was a good reason to do that, I do question why the taxpayer is being asked to burden more cost in the sum of £75,000 to get rid of what was clearly a case of gross misconduct.
Yeah, there was some suggestion, Paul, wasn't there, that potentially he could sue the government. What would you be advising the government at that point, or the Foreign Office at that point, if they rose that, look, if we pay him £75,000, then, we're done with, we don't have to go down that line?
Well, I mean, he'll probably use that £75,000 to fund his lawyers, who are probably terribly expensive, and will probably burn through that in a month or so. So that's what he'll use it for. If I was advising the government, I'd have to see the employment contract. I would be very disappointed if an employer like the government didn't have in a fixed-term contract contractual provisions, because this is, again, about wrongful dismissal. That's what the claim would have been, that they've brought to an end what was a 4-year fixed-term contract prematurely. And Mandelson will be saying, had you completed your end of the contract, I would have earned X pounds, in this case, £500,000. But because you terminated and you didn't have a contractual right to bring that contract to an end, I'm now going to suffer loss and damage through employment, which arguably isn't going to stack up, because I'm sure someone like Mandelson will be able to get another job, or having said that, if he's guilty, he probably won't. I would be saying, let's look at the contract, let's look at the provisions. It's a tough one, because do you spend that money on lawyers, or do you just pay it in a cost-effective way and get rid of the case? They've got rid of it.
Of course, it's important. He's saying at this stage he hasn't done anything wrong. But one of the key questions for government more generally, I think, is what they knew and when. So I suppose, legally speaking, how important is that timeline of events?
Well, it's kind of critical to the argument, because if you go into an employment and you say to your employer, look, I was naughty in my last job, okay, I stole, I committed theft, or I committed fraud, and the employer waives that, acquiesces and says, the new employer, and says, well, that's okay, I'll still give you a job. Now, are they not arguably taking on that risk? They know you've admitted that you're a thief or that you've committed fraud. And then later down the line, they then want to dismiss you for the thing that you already told them that you have a propensity to do. I think that would be a difficult argument. If Mandelson had said, look, I clearly said to the Prime Minister, I clearly said to the talent officer in government, look, all of these things had happened and they employed me anyway. And then a month later or 2 months later, they then sacked me for that reason. I think the government would have a very difficult job in defending such a case because they knew of the risk. They knew of the reputational risk.
There were reputational risks for sure, but it's about due diligence, isn't it?
Well, but how can we question if the government knew, if the person employing you knew of these things, then they've conducted due diligence and they decided to employ you anyway. There can be no criticism there. But that's very different to the public saying, how could you have employed this person who admitted that they had done these things that were going to call the reputation of the British government into disrepute? As a solicitor, I'm independently regulated by a body called the SRA.
Yeah.
Are MPs independently regulated? No, they've got something internal that deals with it. The problem with internal bodies is who is pulling the strings behind the scenes.
So do you think then, based on everything you've said, that this case could potentially prompt how senior appointments are vetted in the future? Do you think that's something that we'll all have to keep our eye on?
Not only should they be independently vetted to make sure that the people that are running this country can be trusted, but when there is misconduct, when there is wrongdoing, there should be an independent body that sets the rules and investigates MPs for that misconduct.
OK, Paul, really interesting to talk to you today. It's Paul Britton, Director, Britton and Time Solicitors. Thank you.